Illegalism: Why pay for a revolution on the installment plan when you can steal one? By Paul Z. Simons. Originally published in the 2014 third edition of the Modern Slavery Journal. Modern Slavery's website is modernslavery.callpress.org. This audiobook was made independently of the authors and editors of Modern Slavery and was recorded by Insurgent-Individualist Radio.
The Workers of the Night. The second foray of anarchists into the criminal milieu is due to one man, Maurice Jacob, who didn't just seem to be able to fit in. Initially a sailor's apprentice on a voyage to Sydney, Australia, he jumped ship at some point in time and among other employments tried piracy, but found it to be too cruel for his tastes. Upon returning to France, he took up typography and militant anarchist activity that ended with him being caught with a parcel of explosives after a string of minor larcenies. Jacob knew when he was beat, and thereafter never sought legitimate employment. Rather, he gathered around him a group of anarchists similarly alienated from the world of work and formed what they termed the Workers of the Night. He used the term pacifistic illegalism to describe this new twist on anarchist activities. Jacob and his band evolved a simple though powerful set of guidelines. One does not kill except to protect one's life and to be free from the police. One steals only from social parasites like bankers, bosses, judges, soldiers, and the clergy, and not from the useful members of societies like doctors, artists, or architects. Finally, a percentage of the proceeds are to be donated to anarchist causes, depending on the choice and taste of the illegalist doing the stealing and the giving. Jacob and his gang proved to be cunning and successful burglars. One of the many tricks they introduced was forcing their way into an apartment from the apartment above. To facilitate this, a small hole was drilled through the floor of the top apartment and into the ceiling of the lower dwelling. A closed umbrella was inserted through the hole and opened so that falling debris and noise would be lessened in the target apartment. From 1900 to 1903, Jacob and his small crew of from 2 to 4 burglars participated in at least 150 burglaries throughout France, including a smash and grab at the Tours Cathedral and pilfering at Admiral's Mansion in Cherbourg. Then, in April of 1903, the whole venture went sour with the slaying of a police officer in Abbeville during an escape. Jacob and his confederates were eventually captured and tried for 2 years later in Amiens. Anarchists flocked to the city to support him, and while his legal defense left much to be desired, he did avoid the guillotine, and was sentenced to life of hard labor in Cayenne. After 17 escape attempts, he was finally pardoned and returned to France, though he was unhappy in Paris, and moved to the Loire Valley, where he continued out with the rest of his life. He eventually remarried and took up a life of commercial travel. His first wife had died while he was in the Bagnais, the Gallic Gulag. In spite of this, his anarchist activities never abated. He traveled to Barcelona in 1936 to volunteer for the Say-Nete 5 militias, but was convinced that the battle would be lost by the communists and the Republicans, and so he returned to France. During the Nazi occupation, he participated in the Marquis sabotage squads, mostly expat Spaniards like Sabate, with a score to settle with any fascist, Spanish or German, primarily as a safe house operator and providing food and succor to the guerrillas. Maurice committed suicide by intentional morphine overdose on August 28, 1954. His suicide was far from a surrender. Rather, he wrote that it was the result of a calm acceptance of being unwilling to fight the rigors of old age. My father committed suicide with a pistol in March of 2008 for much the same reason, and I honor his will and courage in this action. Maurice, in the final years of his life, developed a mixed attitude towards legalism, based in part on the old magnetic attraction of proletarian workerist anarchism. "I don't think," he said, "that illegalism can free the individual in present-day society. If he manages to free himself on a few constraints using this means, the unequal nature of the struggle will create others that are even worse, and, in the end, will lead to the loss of his freedom, the little freedom that he once had, and sometimes his life." Basically, illegalism, considered as an act of revolt, is much more a matter of temperament than of doctrine. This is why it cannot have an educational effect on the working masses as a whole. By this, he continued, I mean a worthwhile educational effect. Strangely, this statement would have been accepted by Bonnet, Garnier, and the other illegalists as being accurate. They were not very interested in propaganda by the deed, rather they were convinced that the deed itself, the robbery, the assassination, was the insurrection. The point was not to educate the masses towards a social revolution, but to realize their insurrection here, now, and for no one else but the individual, and possibly the union of egoists that she surrounds herself with, the herd, the collaborators be damned. Both Jacob Maurice and Clement Duval must be considered ultimately as proto-illegalists. Each saw their respective criminal enterprises as the propaganda of the deed conceptual framework and as les reprises individuelles, basically individual expropriation. The act was justified in a moral universe that turned as nearly as possible to the dominant moral codes of society upside down, but nonetheless acknowledged and accepted society and its flaws as the straw man, the thing that conceptually must be destroyed and altered and to be manipulated in a negative fashion. The illegalists, however, were less interested in social revolution than they were in living in a state of rebellion. Given the chance, they would have saved damn little of the dominant society and certainly wouldn't have used it as a negative paradigm from which to design an anarchist community, which is the single greatest conceptual flaw of workerist anarchism. In this sense, these proto-illegalists seemed more aligned with the mass-based anarchist tendencies than the individualist milieu from which Bonnet and the others would arise. This is best exhibited in Maurice's plowing his ill-gotten gains into any one of a number of anarchist papers and projects, and the fact that such donation was an expected part of the gang's ethics. Both men viewed their crimes as a means to an end, as a way to pay the rent and to also bring about a social revolution that was much closer to fruition by supporting anarchist causes. One is also reminded of Derudi, Ascaso, and Oliver, who during their epistolary period would clearly come closer to Maurice, Duval, or even Nobiling, rather than to, say, a Kropotkin. Yet in their cases, the assassinations and robberies were, among other things, a way to support the CNT and later the FI, and hence were only mildly tinged with anarchist individualist ideas. The success of La Revista Blanca and the popularity of its editors, Frederica Montensi and her father Frederico Urales, would leave a deeply individualist mark on all of Spanish anarchism, including the syndicalist CNT. Given the repression that was present in Spain during this period when such actions were taking place, criminal or not, their outrages were politically consistent and while not illegalist are worth recalling with fondness. Finally, it should be noted that both Marxists and the syndicalists who drew dark, deep, bold lines between crime and the working class did so in spite of very real proclivity of both groups to pass back and forth freely from one social role to the other. Victor Keblacic, of whom more later noted in Paris in the early 1900s, one of the more particular characteristics of working-class Paris at the time was that it was in contact with the riffraff, i.e. with the vast world of irregulars, decadents, wretched ones, and with the equivocal world. There were very few essential differences between the young worker or artisan of the old quarters in the center and the pimps in the alleys of the neighborhoods of Halles. The rather quick-witted driver and mechanic, as a rule, stole whatever they could from their bosses through class spirit and because they were free of prejudices. Similarly, the majority of loss to theft in business today is due less to customers than to employees, conscious enough to fill their backpacks with store inventory and office supplies after a hard day's wage slavery. End of part 2.